She walked into the restaurant that evening with a quiet hope that maybe things would feel different for once, that maybe she wouldn't be treated as though she didn't belong. The smell of freshly cooked meals filled the air, laughter echoed from the tables, and waiters carried trays with elegance. To anyone else it was just another busy evening in a popular restaurant, but for her it was a test of belonging. She had already spent the entire day outside, walking through crowded streets, her stomach empty and her heart heavier than ever. She had saved a little money in her worn-out purse, enough for one meal, and she wanted to enjoy it in a place where people seemed happy, a place where she could pretend, even for a little while, that life was kinder to her. But as soon as she entered, reality struck like a cruel reminder. She scanned the restaurant, her eyes moving from one table to another. Every chair seemed to be occupied. Families laughed together. Couples leaned close. Friends took pictures of their food, but none of them looked her way. She stood near the entrance for a while, telling herself that surely someone would notice her, maybe offer her a seat to share. Her polite smile trembled on her lips as she hoped. But instead of kindness, she was met with avoidance. People deliberately avoided eye contact, their gazes sliding past her as though she was nothing more than a shadow. The waiters, too, didn't bother to approach her. One of them passed by, his arms full of dishes, his cheerful smile reserved for another table. But when his eyes briefly met hers, he quickly turned away as if she wasn't worth acknowledging. Her legs began to ache, yet she stood still, clutching her bag tightly against her chest, trying to summon the courage to ask someone if she could sit. But pride held her back. She had spent too much of her life being ignored, too much of it begging for scraps of attention and kindness. She didn't want to ask again. Not tonight. The sting of rejection was sharper than hunger, and she didn't want to humiliate herself further. The sound of laughter from the next table made her eyes burn. It reminded her of everything she didn't have: companionship, warmth, a sense of belonging. She thought of leaving, of walking back into the cold night with an empty stomach, because at least outside she wouldn't feel the humiliation of being invisible. Yet something inside her resisted. She had walked into that restaurant with hope, and though that hope was fading, she still wanted to believe it wasn't pointless. Her mind drifted back to memories of being left out at school, the way classmates ignored her, the way she was always the last one chosen for anything. It seemed life had never given her a seat at the table, literally and figuratively. Every moment in that restaurant was reopening those wounds, reminding her she was still the outsider no one wanted around. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and her chest grew tight with silent pain. She looked down at the floor, ashamed of her own presence. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let the world see her weakness. To the people around her, she was nothing, but to herself she knew she carried a story of survival, of struggle, of fighting through loneliness every single day. Still, that knowledge did little to ease the hurt of being excluded in such an obvious way. In that moment, she questioned everything. Was it her appearance that made people turn away? Was it the way she stood there, looking nervous and out of place? Or was it simply that kindness had become too rare in the world, that people were too busy in their own comfort to notice the pain of someone standing right in front of them? These thoughts consumed her, and the weight of them made her feel smaller with every passing second. Her pride told her to walk out, to leave before the tears spilled, but her hunger and her fragile hope begged her to stay a little longer. The restaurant buzzed with life, but for her, it was a prison of silence. Every laugh, every clink of glasses, every cheerful conversation felt like a reminder that she was alone in a crowd. She shifted uncomfortably, her heart breaking quietly in a place where no one cared to see, and yet she remained rooted there because deep inside, she longed for someone, anyone, to show her that she was worth noticing, worth offering a chair, worth treating as a human being. She didn't need grand gestures. All she needed was the smallest act of kindness, a simple seat at the table to remind her that she still mattered. She remained standing in that crowded restaurant, her body growing weary, but her spirit still forcing her to endure. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as she stood alone, while around her, people carried on with their meals as if she wasn't even there. The ache in her legs was becoming unbearable, but she clenched her fists and told herself she could handle it. She had handled worse in life. What she couldn't handle was the silence, the way her existence seemed to go unnoticed. Every second was proof that to the world, she was invisible. The waiter walked by again, his cheerful tone reserved for another table where he joked with the customers. For a brief moment she thought he might glance at her, maybe even ask if she needed assistance, but he passed as though she was nothing more than an empty corner. Her heart sank. She didn't want pity. She didn't even want special treatment. She only wanted the simple dignity of being treated like she belonged there. The longer she stood, the more memories crept back into her mind. Memories of being ignored, of being left out at gatherings, of people whispering behind her back as though she didn't deserve to sit with them. All those years of being made to feel like she wasn't good enough seemed to rise up in her chest, heavy and suffocating. She thought about her childhood, how she used to sit quietly in class while the other children laughed and bonded, waiting for someone to notice her, but no one ever did. The loneliness she carried then hadn't disappeared, it had only grown up with her, following her into adulthood. Now in this restaurant full of cheerful people, that same loneliness mocked her all over again. Her stomach tightened with hunger. She had skipped meals before, but tonight it hurt more, because she was so close to what she needed yet still denied it by something as simple as a chair. She could smell the food being served, the aroma of bread, the sizzling of freshly cooked meat, the sweetness of desserts passing by her. But each scent was like a cruel reminder of what she didn't have. She clenched her jaw, fighting back tears because she didn't want anyone to see her weakness, though no one was even looking. She wanted to walk out, to escape the humiliation, but the thought of stepping back into the cold night air with an empty stomach made her stay a little longer. It wasn't just about food anymore, it was about worth. Standing there watching everyone avoid her presence, she asked herself questions that cut deep into her soul. Was she so unworthy that not a single person could offer a chair? Was kindness so rare that it had completely vanished from the world around her? She had always believed that people were capable of goodness, but moments like these shook that belief. She wanted so badly to hold on to hope, but each passing minute made it harder. The voices of laughter and chatter around her felt like sharp echoes, reminding her of her exclusion. Her pride and her desperation battled inside her. Pride told her to leave before she embarrassed herself further, to walk away with what little dignity she had left. But desperation held her back, whispering that maybe if she waited just a bit longer, something would change. She imagined what it would feel like if someone actually pulled out a chair for her. Just that thought alone made her chest tighten with both longing and sadness. She didn't want much. She didn't need someone to buy her meal or shower her with attention. All she craved was acknowledgement. The feeling that she wasn't invisible, that someone cared enough to share the simplest gesture of humanity. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the strap of her bag, trying to distract herself from the sting of rejection. She looked around once more, her eyes scanning each table in desperation, but no one met her gaze. Some laughed louder, some leaned in closer to their companions, as though to seal themselves off from the possibility of having to acknowledge her. The waiter passed again, and this time her hope truly broke. She realized he had no intention of helping her. To him she was simply not worth the time. She stood there longer, but her heart was unraveling thread by thread. The loneliness was no longer silent. It screamed inside her louder than the laughter around her. She wanted to cry, but she held it back, determined not to let the world see her weakness. In that restaurant filled with warmth and joy, she was colder and lonelier than she had ever been. And yet she remained standing, waiting for something she wasn't sure would ever come. Because somewhere deep inside she still hoped, just a flicker of hope, that someone, anyone, would finally notice her, and prove that kindness had not completely disappeared from the world. Just when her heart had almost given up and her pride was urging her to leave, a gentle voice broke through the noise of the restaurant. For a moment she thought she had imagined it. But then the words reached her clearly. "Excuse me, miss. You can sit here." She lifted her eyes in disbelief, unsure if the voice was truly directed at her. All around, people continued their meals, talking and laughing as though nothing unusual had happened. But standing near one of the tables was a young man, his expression calm, his smile warm, and his hand resting on the back of a chair he had pulled out just for her. It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of everything she had been waiting for. For a long second, she couldn't move. Her body froze between hesitation and longing. No one had ever done this for her before, not in a place like this, not in front of so many others. Her eyes searched his face, trying to understand if it was real kindness or some cruel joke, but his gaze held nothing but sincerity. He didn't look at her with pity, nor did he appear to do it for attention. He simply saw her standing alone, and that was enough reason for him to act. Her throat tightened as a storm of emotions rushed through her. Pride whispered not to accept, telling her that sitting down would mean admitting she needed someone's help. But hunger, exhaustion, and the deep ache of being ignored pushed her forward. For the first time that night, someone had noticed her, and it was a moment too rare to let slip away. Slowly, with shaky steps, she began to walk toward him. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though her past rejections were clinging to her ankles, trying to hold her back. But his smile, steady and patient, gave her strength to continue. The other diners barely paid attention, too absorbed in their own meals and conversations. To them it was nothing extraordinary, but to her, it was everything. That chair was not just a seat, it was recognition, dignity, and a reminder that she was human and worthy of kindness. As she reached the table, her trembling hand brushed against the wooden chair. She hesitated again, looking at him one last time, searching for any sign of insincerity. Instead, she saw only gentleness, a silent reassurance that she belonged there just as much as anyone else. When she finally lowered herself into the chair, It felt like she was releasing years of silent battles. The ache in her legs eased, but more than that, the ache in her heart softened. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen. She wanted to thank him, to say something meaningful, but the words caught in her throat. All she managed was a faint whisper, a fragile thank you almost lost beneath the noise of clinking glasses and cheerful chatter. But he heard it, and he nodded with the same quiet kindness that had brought her to this moment. She looked around the restaurant again, and though nothing else had changed, the same laughter, the same voices, the same air of indifference, the world looked different to her now. That small gesture had shifted something inside her. She no longer felt like an outsider peering in through a window. She was sitting, she was present, and she belonged, even if only for that one meal. The pain of being ignored for so long didn't disappear instantly, but the heaviness lifted just enough to let her breathe easier. Her heart swelled with gratitude, not just for the chair, but for the reminder that kindness still existed, that humanity hadn't been completely lost in the noise of selfishness. It wasn't a grand act, it wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was pure. In a world where she had been overlooked too many times to count, this one act of simple generosity became a turning point. It told her she mattered, even if only to one person in that moment. And sometimes, one person was enough to change everything. As she settled into the chair, the weight she had been carrying all evening began to ease, though it did not vanish completely. For so long she had been invisible, passed by and ignored, yet now she found herself seated at a table because one man had chosen to notice her. The relief that washed over her was more than physical, it touched something deep within her spirit. Her heart, bruised from years of silent neglect, softened in that single moment. She glanced at the man again, expecting questions or judgment in his eyes, but there was none. He didn't ask why she had been standing so long, nor did he try to pry into her life. Instead he returned to his meal, treating her presence as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That more than anything made her feel safe. The simplicity of it struck her. He hadn't made a grand speech, hadn't sought attention, hadn't acted as though he had done something extraordinary. To him it seemed to be nothing more than an instinctive act of decency. Yet for her, it meant more than he could ever know. She watched him for a while, her mind unable to quiet the emotions swirling within. Gratitude mixed with disbelief, and disbelief mixed with a strange sense of hope she had not felt in years. The room around her still buzzed with laughter and conversation, but the sound no longer pierced her. She no longer felt like an outsider watching life from the shadows. She was a part of it, even if only in a small way. As she sat there, she began to notice something else. No one else had offered her a seat. No one else had paused to acknowledge her, and yet it had only taken one person to change everything. One act had rewritten the entire evening. The ache in her legs subsided, but more than that, the ache in her soul began to heal. She realized how deeply she had craved the simplest reminder that she still mattered. It was not about the chair itself, it was about being seen, being valued, being reminded that she was human in a world that so often forgot. She thought about how close she had been to walking away, to leaving the restaurant and carrying with her another memory of rejection. If she had done that, the pain would have grown heavier, adding to the countless other times she had been overlooked. But instead she had waited a little longer, and because of that she had been given this moment. It reminded her that sometimes hope lingers quietly, even when it feels impossible. She wondered how different the world would be if more people acted with such kindness, if more people chose to notice instead of ignore. She looked at him once again, still unsure how to fully express the depth of her gratitude. Words felt too small compared to the enormity of what she was feeling. But maybe words weren't necessary. Maybe the fact that she accepted his kindness was enough, and maybe the faint smile she offered him carried more weight than she realized. He smiled back briefly, a silent acknowledgement that needed no further explanation. It was as if they both understood that kindness didn't always need to be spoken. It only needed to be lived. In that restaurant, where only minutes before she had felt like the loneliest person in the world, she now felt a quiet warmth spreading within her. The world outside hadn't changed. People still hurried past one another with their own concerns, and indifference still existed everywhere. But she now carried with her the knowledge that not all hearts were cold, that compassion had not been completely erased from the world. All it took was one person, one chair, one gesture. As she sat back and allowed herself to breathe, she realized this was more than a moment of relief. It was the beginning of change, not in the world around her but within her. She would carry this memory like a light in the dark, a reminder that no matter how invisible she felt, there would always be the possibility of someone noticing, of someone caring, and perhaps one day she too could be that person for someone else, offering the same kindness she had received. For now she savored the simple truth. She was no longer standing alone. She was no longer unseen. Someone had pulled out a chair for her, and in doing so had pulled her back into the world she thought she had lost.